Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules today to join us for our quarterly webinar. This is David Trepp with BPM. I'm joined today by Scott Hyman, an attorney with Severson and Werson, and we're going to look at the cybersecurity breach issue this morning from both sides, both issues that we can take home back to the office to help us avoid breaches, and a couple of pieces of guidance on what to do in that unfortunate event that a breach occurs and we need to respond. So that's our topic for today. Just before we get started, a couple quick housekeeping notes. For today's webinar, you are all set up as attendees, and so you are probably auto-muted by the application, but please don't hesitate to unmute and speak up or use the chat bar when you have a question or comment, because of course we're here to answer your questions and address your issues. So please don't hesitate to speak up. Both Scott and I invite your questions and comments. For those of you attending this morning for CPE credits, this class does earn a 1-hour CPE credit. And the way to track on your CPE credits for this is to watch for the code words. So as you can see, those code words will be in red ink. They'll be bold and underlined, so they'll jump right out at you. So please note those 3 words or Easter eggs as we go through the report. They will be the 3 words that you need to report on for the survey that you'll get right near the end of the class. So for those of you attending for CPE credits, you'll get an email just before the end of class. You'll need to record those 3 words that you've seen through the slides. And then I believe it's about a week or so after the seminar today, you will receive your certificate for attendance so that you can use that for your evidence of your continuing ed credits. So for today's webinar, we're going to break it into 2 parts. Scott is going to begin this morning by talking to us about administrative and human considerations surrounding breach, avoidance, and response. And then I'll wrap up with a very brief section on some of the key technical considerations that you'll want to keep in mind for, again, breach, both preparedness and response abilities. We're really excited to have Scott join us today. Scott is a partner or a shareholder with Severson and Werson, a full-service law firm operating in the Bay Area and in Orange County area. Scott heads up the data privacy group for Severson Werson. He's a CIPP, a Certified Information Privacy Professional, and a CIPM, Certified Information Privacy Manager, and really a thought leader in this area. So if you're looking for legal resources for these types of issues and any other privacy, security related issues, we would recommend you reach out to Scott and team. They have a wide array of talent, and Scott will show just a little hint of that talent and knowledge in our presentation this morning. So without any further ado, Scott, we'll turn it over to you and let you take it away.
Great, David. Thanks. I'm certainly humbled by the introduction. I appreciate it, and great to work with you and to speak with everybody online today. I wanted to thank Oleg Brilliant, who's our IT director here in San Francisco, and Scott Benter in our Irvine office for helping out, and Diane Craig, who's an attorney in our San Francisco office in our employment practices group, who also helped us put this together. You know, we're going to talk a lot about the human side of this and cybersecurity and cyber protection. And what I've found when I speak to my clients about cybersecurity is the first reaction is, well, I got somebody for that. You know, I got somebody in my MIS handles that. And what I'm here to talk about here is really creating a culture of privacy within your company. And it's beyond simply cybersecurity is beyond delegating the responsibilities of cyber protection to your MIS person or MIS department. Cybersecurity is a human problem. It's why the human aspect of cybersecurity and cyber protection is why it has become such a big issue today, and why we're doing this today. And if you think that this really isn't your problem, because maybe you're not a big enough company, or again, you've got a person who handles this for you, think about the idea that really one human error, one ransomware incident, one person in your company downloads a virus because you don't have policies and procedures in place, and you're shut down until David and his crew can come in and fix things up for you and get you started again. And so this human aspect of cyber protection is the thing that I'm going to talk largely about. It starts because, employees come to your workplace and they're connected and interconnected both with your workplace through your workplace devices. They're interconnected to each other through their own devices. They may be logging in through your Wi-Fi. We're going to talk a little bit about you bring your own device policy protections and things, but people can and do come and work from anywhere in today's economy. Employees do, and they bring their own devices. They use cloud-based applications. They access their work files from mobile devices, from home, and from home, and also, so there is great risk in that human factor of cybersecurity. So the regulators recognize it, the courts are recognizing it, the legislature is recognizing it. They're a little slow to catch on, but when they catch on, they come on in full voice. And there's a recognition of industry and amongst the regulators and the legislators that you're going to have a cyber incident. You may not have a cyber breach, but you're going to have a cyber incident at some point that you're going to have to deal with. And the faster that you deal with things, the better the procedures that you have in place to prevent it, the better procedures that you also have in place to deal with it. And so it's very important to have this culture of privacy that's created within the company. And who is in charge of it? Well, everybody who's on this particular slide is in charge of it. From your C-suite and high-level management down to if you've got a compliance officer or a data protection officer, to if you're large enough to have a legal department or you've got an outside law firm to help you out, management information systems, InfoSec, security, your HR people are crucial. Mid-level management who are speaking to the general population of your employees, the employees themselves, and obviously vendors. Vendors are a huge security risk for companies. So the first thing that when you think about, we're going to keep coming back to this culture of privacy, you have to think about how you're going to assemble this team. How are you going to put together a team that is prepared to, on the front end, help you avoid cyber breach issues, and on the back end, that if you have a cyber incident, that you're prepared and you have a turnkey operation in place to deal with it. So you need CSuite BuyIn. Well, what does that mean? It means two things. It means money, obviously, it means budget, but it also means leadership from the top. It means that whether it's C-suite, if you're not large enough to have a C-suite, but high-level management has bought into it. Human resources needs to understand that privacy is part of their job description. It's part of their job description in not only maintaining security, but in implementing the policies and procedures of the company to create this culture of compliance. If you've got inside counsel or you've got outside counsel, they have various roles. One is to advise you on, from an employment standpoint, what your rights and obligations are with respect to your employees, but also with respect to privacy, with regard to data, keeping it private, and what your responsibilities are with respect to a breach if something like that happens. You may be from an industry that is regulated, from, like, for example, the healthcare industry or the financial services industry, that you have particular privacy laws that are applicable to your industry. And the legal department is going to help you lay down that umbrella over what your obligations are. And finally, insurance is a crucial aspect of the whole part of assembling the team. You should be speaking with your insurance brokers about what cyber insurance and business interruption insurance is available in the event that something bad happens to you that you need to deal with. IT and management information systems, they obviously, they deal with what we call in the banking industry with safety and soundness, to make sure that you are hardwired and protected from physical intrusion. MIS protects also with regard to physical data intrusion, and on the back end, they can make sure that you have that you have the forensic ability to dig back in and to find out what's happened if someone has tried to get into your system externally, or if you have some internal issue where there is a breach. The crucial aspect of all this is that you need to have coordination, you need to have integration, and this is something we're going to keep, another buzzword we're going to keep talking about, which is substantiation. Substantiation is if you do the policies, if you write the policies, then you have to implement them, and you have to test them, and you have to check. And so you have to substantiate that what you're doing is working, or if you've got a hole in your system, that you find it and that you plug it. Many larger companies now are doing what in Europe is required, which is to have what's called a data protection officer, or a DPO. That's protected. That's a required position under European law, but we are seeing American law moving towards that direction, and it's not required yet, but I wouldn't be surprised to see in 5 years or so that position is something that's required. And certainly a best practices would suggest that you have someone whose job it is to deal with privacy aspects, whether you give them the position or call them a data protection officer, or that they just understand that that's part of their job responsibilities. But the crux of what a DPO does, or someone whose responsibility it is to handle the responsibilities of what a DPO would do, is that they're responsible for overseeing data protection strategy and implementation to ensure that you're complying with legal requirements. They're sort of a clearinghouse or an umbrella person of all the people that we've mentioned in assembling this team. And there's no particular qualifications that are required. They don't have to be an MIS person or an InfoSec person or HR or a lawyer, but they just have to be someone who understands that they have expert knowledge in data protection law and practices, so that they are able to pull in from all different directions and all different departments to assemble the proper team. And the last responsibility that this person would have, whoever it is, again, if you're not large enough to appoint a DPO, but someone whose job it is to handle privacy aspects, that their expertise aligns with the organization's data protection operations and the level of data protection that's required for the personal data processed by the controllers, the people that are controlling or handling or protecting the data. So once you've assembled this team, well, then what do? You go to the next part, which is you have to figure out what you got. Again, coordination, unification, substantiation. So what do you got? You triage, okay? And if you take two things from this, I would say these are the two things. One, figure out and look at what your policies and procedures are, and are they adequate? And then the second thing is that you've done some kind of threat assessment, that you've looked at both internal and external threats to your company for a cyber breach. What we see is, and what the data tells us is that most cybersecurity threats, and David can agree or disagree, but what we've seen is that they come from inside the company. And that's not necessarily like a disgruntled employee, although that's obviously something, but it's mistakes made inside the company. And so, you know, for example, they may send files of personal or private information to a threat actor, you know, that, like, as in phishing or spear phishing, or that they've opened an email that has a virus or that has ransomware attached to it, or that they've lost their phone, or that they're not using proper passwords, or they've left their iPad in the airport, or you know, there's a host of sort of negligence things where there can be data leakage from employee negligence. Obviously, the flip side of that equation can be where you have a disaffected employee, someone who decides either while they're an employee with the company or after they're no longer an employee with the company, that they want to get revenge towards the company, and that they're discharging or stealing data or sharing data, or they're downloading things that they shouldn't download. And so we have seen as high as half of the cybersecurity incidents that are reported come from disaffected employees. And, you know, part of that can be just allowing access to your system, in a way of either through omission or commission, logging on to unsecure Wi-Fi networks, using passwords, again, using lousy passwords that are able to be hacked into. And, you know, one of the things that the cyber criminals are doing that we are seeing, that our clients have seen, is that they will approach insiders inside the company, employees inside the company, to try to find a way to hack into your system or to get data from your system. So when you're doing that inventory, again, threat assessment, evaluating your policies and procedures, it's got to be a coordinated issue. You want to have a privacy policy, a written privacy policy that explains to your employees what your policies are and what your goals are. A written hacking recovery incident response policy. So that is a turnkey operation. We'll talk about that some more later. But that when this happens, you're not running around trying to find out, oh my gosh, who should we find as a forensic accountant, or a forensic management information systems person. Who is our outside counsel? What's the name of our insurance company again? You know, as you spend all that time trying to have beauty contests about who you're going to retain, your data is still going out the door. And so you need to have that so that you can deal with it quickly. You need to have a record retention policy. How long? What's the law required? What's your disposition policy? Where's it going to? You know, how does that data have to be segregated in a way that some data is retained for legal purposes, but other is not retained because it's not reporting, is not important. Corruption and laundering policies, external privacy audits. If you have folks that, if you're in a regulated industry, you need to maintain those audits because they will be coming in and doing privacy audits of your company. A vendor management policy. I'll talk a little bit more about that in later on in the presentation. But you need to make sure that you're dealing with your vendors, that you have contracts in place, and that that privacy is part of your relationship with those vendors. And finally, again, data mapping in the architecture of your system, and that's our first Easter egg, is where your data is, what's stored, where is it stored, How is it stored? Is it segregated? What's the architecture of your system? So then the next part is again, it has to be integrated. So your employees need to understand what the do's and don'ts are of cybersecurity. There's two truisms. One is that one person can't do it all. You can't rely just on your HR person or your management information person, because everybody is bringing different expertises and accesses to the company. And then the second thing is unless you've got a disgruntled employee, no one wants to be that employee, the one who downloaded the spear phishing email that shut down the company for 3 days. No one wants to be that person. And so when you have these written policies and procedures in place, everybody understands the culture of privacy. They have the notice, they have buy-in, everybody agrees and understands. They're all being treated the same way. You've implemented it. They're not complaining about the training. They understand it's part of their job, and they understand that there's going to be substantiation, that they're going to be responsible, and there's going to be input, and it's going to be part of their review process for their knowledge of data security and whether they are doing their job. A big part of that is, and on the next slide, is your employee handbook. And your employee handbook is your contract with your employees at each stage. And they will understand that privacy is part of the culture of the company, and it's part of their job description, and it's part of what they do. And we sort of break this down into possibles, people that you might be hiring, the presents, your present and current employees, and your past employees. But your employee handbook is your resource for your employees. It sets forth everybody's expectations. And again, coming back to our integration theme, with everybody's got to have some input. Every part of your privacy team has to give some input so that privacy becomes part of that contract with your employee. With your IT people, not only what does work, but what will work within the company of your within the culture of your company, in the size of your company, and the kind of data that your company is handling. With legal, what's required, what's permitted, and finally, what's improper. What can't you do? With your data protection officer, if you have one, or someone whose responsibility is privacy, what's at risk? What's the standard? What's the company's goals with respect to privacy and maintaining privacy? And then again, with regard to HR, if you have an HR person or a department, what's the employer side expectations and what's the employee side expectations? And how does that fit in with your particular culture? And how is it going to be implemented? So with regard to your possible employees, you want to hire the right people, obviously. So, you're doing background checks and consumer credit reports. And the employee handbook is going to set forth for potential employees what the expectations are with regard to privacy, including bring your own devices, the ability of what they can do in terms of bringing their own things. And using them in connection with it. Then you have your current employees. What's the acceptable use policy? Can you log on to your own Gmail account? What websites are appropriate? What access are you going to have to websites while you're on the job? Security, duties to maintain confidences, the duty to report breaches or loss. So here's something a little bit of the doctrine of unintended consequences. Our experience is that you want to make sure that breaches are reported. And if you have employees who think they're going to be terminated every time that there's that there is an incident, then they may be more hesitant to report. So you want to establish a culture where they're going to report these incidents to you on a regular basis, that they understand that they have ongoing duties. You want your handbook to say who owns what data. If under bring your own device policy, you have an iPhone, And, you know, maybe I've got my family pictures on my iPhone, but it's an iPhone that's provided by my company. You need to discuss about who owns that data and what happens with it. Access or denial of access. You know, what's going to happen if you're terminated? Where's that data going to go? What are the consequences of breach? Again, and then there's this right to be forgotten and duty to delete policies. Those are, again, under European laws, but we're seeing these things sneak into American law about the rights of employees to ask you to delete their data, or the right to be forgotten within your system. So you would want to consult with legal on the extent to which that's required. So then we move on to, you know, sort of mitigating the risk. Again, we talked about triage, doing a threat assessment. External and internal is the way that we sort of break this down. Your external threats are coming obviously from the things that are within David's expertise, which are hacking and theft, phishing, spear phishing, malware, safety and soundness breaches, vendor management. There's a famous case in California where a hospital did not know that one of their vendors was having the doctor's notes transcribed by an overseas company. And the vendor was not paying that overseas company, and the way the hospital found out about it was because the overseas company called up the hospital and said, we've got all this patient information. So that's all part of vendor management, reps and warranties, audits, and of course making sure that your vendors have insurance. You know, landlord-tenant issues. You could have the best policies and procedures in the world and have your office and facilities on lockdown, and then your landlord brings in the cleaning crew every night to go through and clean your offices. And you have no clean desk policy, and you have no privacy policy with your landlord on background checks of the people that are going to have access to your office. So when you peel back the onion on these things, this is all part of the threat assessment. And then obviously records management and disposal. You know, you want to make sure that the people that are disposing of your records or are storing your records are similarly on lockdown. And then when they're disposing of your records, that they're actually disposing of them in a way that can't be traced back to your clients. That puts us over to the sort of internal threat side, which is, again, we've talked a little bit about this employee negligence and the culture of privacy. Having your employees just understand that that's part of their job. Bring your own device policies. You know, this is where you have integration and coordination. Your HR, your MIS folks have to tell HR what can be done. Your HR people have to implement that with your employees. Your top-down C-suite or management folks have to make a decision on, are we going to let people bring their own phones? Are we going to provide their iPhones to them? What access are we going to allow? What access does the law allow us to engage in? And then you've got procedures in place to deal with disgruntled, and I will say current and former employees, so that you're not creating internal risks. When you're dealing, when you're dealing with, again, mitigating risk, one of the things that's is crucial, again, is employee training. And so that comes on onboarding when they come in, that it's done annually. It's part of their employee reviews every year, and that it's appropriate to the position. What somebody, the training that's required for someone that's handling, patient records is going to be very different than the kind of training that might be required for, someone who's at a reception desk. But training is required both ways nonetheless. And when you get to, again, starting to think about a data breach, it's got to be a turnkey company-wide response policy that's in place. CSuite BuyIn, retention of these individuals before it happens, outside counsel, if you're big enough, maybe public relations, who's your insurance broker, that you've got a forensic data person like David that's there and ready to come in on the back end, that you have a crisis management, frankly, point person. That may be your DPO, but someone who's in a place that can speak for the company externally, but also can do internal messaging to your employees. If you have a data breach, you want to not only speak externally to handle your company's reputation, but you want to also speak internally to your employees and remind them of their culture of privacy, what happened, how to stop it the next time, and what's being done to fix that particular breach. And then obviously, if you've got the written procedures in place, boy, somebody sure better be able to find them. They need to be written, clearly written, and they need to be openly kept. People need to know where they are, so that if your crisis management person is on vacation in the Turks and Caicos, that when the data breach happens, that you don't have to wait a week until that person comes back from vacation to handle the data breach, because you don't know who you're supposed to call. And then the last thing is, again, this sort of goes to substantiation. And David, if you want to sort of jump in here a little bit, and I know you're going to talk about this some more, but periodic monitoring. What's the difference between an incident and a breach? Not all incidents are breaches, but all breaches are incidents. An incident can be somebody trying to get into your system but is unsuccessful. An incident can be somebody losing their phone that you're able to shut down remotely. But the breach is the actual release of data, is the actual downloading of a malicious software that results in the data being released. And so when you're doing this monitoring and testing, you want to look for, as part of your substantiation process, outliers and trends. What are you seeing? Where are your incidents coming from? Because it's a little bit like, incidents are a little bit like skin cancer. You want to keep an eye on it and watch it so that it doesn't turn into something worse. And that means looking at what a trend is as a potential breach, that could happen in the future. Or that there's an outlier, that this particular thing happened that's so kind of crazy and different than what you're seeing, and why did that happen? And so you could do testing, maybe fire drills, do some role playing with some of your folks. And then in the end, obviously, somebody's got to look at this stuff. It can be your privacy officer, it can be your MIS person, but somebody's got to look at it and evaluate it, right, David? I mean, when you see those sorts of things.
Absolutely, and it's really the most important thing I think you can do as far as avoidance is concerned, is to do that testing and fire drill type activity and the reporting. Those to me are the key elements.
And so, then of course, and we know that this is going to happen. You're going to have an incident. You're for sure going to have an incident. Hopefully you don't have a breach, but the odds are that there's going to be some breach of some kind. So what do you do to respond? And again, as if I'm hoping this is coming across, but you expect the unexpected. If you've looked at this on the front end, then you're monitoring the incidents. You're looking at the kind of things that are happening to your company, the people that are the barbarians at the gates that are testing your resources to see where the fault lines are. But it happens, okay? So now what do you do? First, what happened? What's the type of breach? Is it malware? Was it a release? Did somebody hack into your system? You know, what happened? Then, and we think of this in terms of a timeline of an incident breach, you know, and in the first, 6 hours, this is what you're doing, okay? What happened? What's the nature of it? How big is it? What's the sensitivity of the compromise? In other words, did they take healthcare records or financial records of consumers, or did they take your trade secrets, or did they just take a bunch of memos or something like that? I mean, so you've got to figure out what was taken, because different laws may govern your response. And that goes to, again, the identification of affected data subjects and what the sensitivity of the data is. Are they vulnerable people? Are they children? What states are they from? If you can determine, if you can figure that out. And so once you've started that triage process, then you sort of got to figure out, what's the consequences? And this is where you started, you've got your team together. And obviously then as you're determining the scope of the breach, then you're figuring out, all right, how do we control this? Again, and this is where your MIS folks and folks like David come in, and all right, how do we bracket this? Is it ongoing? Is it a one-time incident? Is there another Trojan horse somewhere in our system that we need to find? But the key is here, if you've done what we've talked about in the other 8 preceding slides, what you're essentially doing here is you're pushing play. You're implementing the procedures that you've already set up. Your DPO, your HR person, your MIS person, your counsel, and then depending on the nature, volume, and sensitivity of the compromise, maybe you need to start thinking about public relations, your insurance people. You've got everybody on notice, and you're getting input from different sources about what your obligations are, how you control it, and how you protect your organization. So when you bring in those folks, again, you're going to consult with counsel. They're going to tell you, all right, now that we're through our first 6 hours, we know now the nature, volume, and sensitivity of the compromise. We've got a good idea of how big the compromise is. We've got a good idea of what the kind of the data it is, and we've got a good idea of what the scope is. Now, your counsel can tell you, well, based on the size, based on the sensitivity, based on the residence of the particular data subjects, these are what your legal obligations are. If you're a regulated industry, then you may have regulatory reporting. This is when you have access to C-suite or to upper level management. They may want to be the ones who speak to the internally to the company or externally to others, but they may not be the right people to do that. And this is all part of the evaluative process. There may be other investors or interested parties that you need to discuss this issue with. You may want to talk to your insurance carrier, depending on the size, to see if you have coverage for the cyber breach, and or if there's interruption to your business, whether there's some business interruption coverage because of the stop of your business to handle the cyber breach. And so once you've gone through those first 6 hours, in the next 12 to 24 or 48 hours, you are able to start implementing these plans. And then again, as part of our substantiation process, you're coming back, you have a point person who is coming back and reporting to the company, to the decision makers and to the stakeholders of what the process is with regard to the cybersecurity breach and what you're doing and what's happening, how you're controlling it, and how you're protecting the company. And so I think that before I turn it over to David here, you know, I would just kind of say, again, if you have a couple of takeaways from the human aspect of what we're talking about with regard to cybersecurity, I know this sounds like a lot, and it may seem like a lot for a smaller company. And so what I would tell you is, again, the two important things that you do is that you create your culture of privacy by expertising somebody who understands that it's part of their job to do privacy and to protect against cyber attacks and to protect cyber security. And then secondly, that you triage your risk. You figure out where your greatest vulnerability is. And again, as we were saying, we think the biggest vulnerability there is the human aspect. And if you take that into account as one of your biggest aspects, that's something that you have control over. And so so handle the things that you have control over. So that involves an inventory, a triage risk, some planning, some training, and substantiation. And if you're small enough that you don't feel like, you know, well, I can't really hire a data protection officer, or I don't have an in-house counsel or something like that, then, you know, bring in somebody to do an hour of cyber training and privacy training for your folks. Bring in somebody like David to do to do a cyber risk assessment for your business and help you triage your risk and figure out where your dollars are best spent.
Great stuff, Scott. Thank you. We couldn't agree more on our end that the human aspect is almost certainly the biggest risk that most organizations face. And your point about the insider threat as part of that is also supported on our end. From our experience, we concur with that. At least half of breaches involve some kind of insider component. Our experience tells us those numbers are accurate. And indeed, you mentioned cleaning crews. In our world, a clean desk policy is not sufficient. We actually pay one of our vetted employees to do our janitorial service because we will not allow outsiders in our offices after hours to have run of the place while no one is around. So we actually have an employee do our janitorial work during business hours while everybody's here. So really good, really great content on that, and we try to practice what we preach when it comes to that. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Scott at this point? Right, great. Well, then we'll move on real quickly. We had the lead investigator slide here, Scott. I'm sorry. Any comments on the lead investigator that we didn't cover already?
No, I think so. I think we covered it in terms of again, just having a point person, you know, who understands that it's their responsibility to put together a forward-looking timeline. We covered this. I sort of went through it, but having that forward-looking timeline. The only thing we really didn't talk about, and I'll just be very brief because I don't want to take up your time, is, you know, understanding a little bit about the scope of the attorney-client privilege and work product privilege. If you engage counsel, you want to make sure that everybody understands what we call the upjohn privilege, and whether or not the investigation of the scope of the data breach is something that you want to try to protect with the attorney-client privilege. And if you do want to do that based on the advice of counsel, that you are advised on how you do that, because you're bringing different stakeholders in to assist you in that investigation. Yeah,
great point. And if you don't have a lot of reporting requirements, you are probably, most organizations are inclined to invoke that attorney-client privilege. Yeah. And for those of you tracking for CPEs, there's our second Easter egg there, the centralized word. Okay, great. So I'm going to wrap up real briefly now with a review of some of the technical considerations. So we're going to start by covering a little bit of the ground that Scott already covered, but looking at it from more of a technical perspective. So when we look at it from the zeros and ones point of view, defining what you're trying to protect looks like asset inventories, classification schemes. So we need to know what our information assets are. Where do we have information both at rest and in transit? Is it stored locally on workstations? Is all the data storage centralized? Do we have some of it on our backups that we have to be concerned about, and so forth? So all of the places that data may reside and all of the places that data may be transmitted. So is this leaving the organization as we communicate with vendors or key suppliers or things like that? Is it all kept within? Are we backing up offline or on the cloud or something in a way that will take those data and move them outside the network? And an information classification scheme is also really important from our perspective. So what are the confidential data? What are the sensitive or restricted data? What are the open public data? And determining the nature of the data that have been compromised in a breach is really important when it comes to reporting obligations and assessing the impact of the breach overall. And then lastly, that segmentation and boundaries considerations. As Scott began his presentation, he talked about your systems and your employees' BYOD devices and so forth that really create very indistinct boundaries around your systems. Your systems aren't just your network and a firewall and then the internet. It's not that simple anymore, right? There are all kinds of backdoors. There are all kinds of BYOD devices. There are all kinds of vendor relationships, cloud services, reporting requirements, and so forth that may blur those boundaries. So understanding where your boundaries are and how the data moves through and across those boundaries is essential. And then really need to know from a technological perspective what a normal or baseline activity level looks like. And again, Scott alluded to this a little bit from a technologist perspective. What we're really talking about here is things like, what does normal traffic on your internal network, across your firewall, through the wireless system, what does normal traffic look like? What are those patterns? What are normal log entries that are generated? You got all kinds of systems that generate log entries, from Windows to network devices to proxies and browsers and so forth. And what does the normal set of log entries look like? Because of course we want to look at what anomalous entries look like. Again, what is normal bandwidth usage? How much are we using of system resources? And lastly, of course, what does normal performance look like? What are our lag times? What are our expectations for quality of service and so forth from a performance perspective? If we don't know what these things are in a baseline or ordinary usage circumstance, then we were going to have difficulty identifying what incidents and then breaches are. And so, of course, to identify then a breach, we have to have the right tools. These tools are, they're big, they're clunky, they're difficult to manage. Traditionally, intrusion detection systems and security incident and event management systems are the most common identification tools out there. They are, as you can see in the bullets here, they're really designed to distinguish between an incident and a breach and draw that line between normal behavior, anomalous behavior, and evidence of an actual breach. And they can work at all kinds of different layers. There are tools that look at network traffic, network activity, and so forth and so on. And then there are those that focus on applications. So if you've got key data stored in key applications, applications that face the outside world for client services, applications internal that may be practice management or information storing applications that hold your intellectual property or information on your employees, HR systems and so forth. Application-based intrusion detection and SIM systems can be very effective for zeroing in on those systems that are the key data stores and data transmitters. And when I mention that these things are big and awkward and clunky, this is a real issue for folks who are looking to try to manage these systems in-house. If you're not a large organization, there's a decent chance that you do not have sufficient overhead to really monitor these things 24/7. I mean, somebody's got to be awake at the wheel at all hours of the day. Criminal hackers and nation-state sponsored entities, they're in completely different time zones, and most of them are somewhere into tomorrow as far as our timeline is concerned. So being awake and monitoring the console from 8 to 5 is not sufficient. It's got to be done 24/7. So a lot of smaller organizations look to outsource this type of service so that you can get those experts who are staffing around the clock, following the sun all the time, and handling things. Have a breach laptop. This is something that unfortunately very few of our customers go to the trouble to do. But the truth is, a breach laptop is really an ounce of prevention rather than a pound of cure. So laptop is not expensive. And again, if you have IT people in-house who can manage this, great. If you're so small that you need to outsource all of your IT to a third-party vendor, your third-party vendor can do this for a small additional expense. You know, a laptop is not expensive. It needs just a couple of software licenses on it, and it's ready to go. This breach laptop should be disconnected from the network so that if the malware or ransomware enters your network and starts propagating across the network, it will not propagate to this laptop. So we want to have it air-gapped. But it should have full network level privileges. So we want to set it up as though it is a system or domain administrator on the network with all the requisite privilege levels, and then disconnect it for emergency use only. And then we want to have some administrative tools, and I won't go into these for the technical folks. We can talk about these offline, but traffic analysis tools like Wireshark, key systems administrative tools like Microsoft sysinternals. You also want to have your password database. So LastPass or KeyPass or one of those types of applications that has all of the key credentials, the URLs to find the applications and so forth, all in one place. Because if your system has been encrypted by ransomware, you are no longer going to be able to get to your password database. Now, of course, keeping that up to date as you constantly change passwords is a challenge, especially if this laptop sets offline, disconnected from the network. You got to take the time out to manually sit down and keep it updated. You want to have your backup and restore software loaded on this laptop. So when the time comes to try to perform a restore from backups, and we'll talk about backups in the next slide, you've got the system that can effect that restore right there on the laptop. We also want to have all of your key application license information. So the keys, the certificates, the license numbers, whatever it may be, so that you can contact the vendors who you may need to download fresh copies of or whatever, depending on the nature of the breach. And then lastly, ransomware eradication tools. And we'll talk about ransomware in just a second. But first, offline backups. You need to have a really solid backup plan. It needs to take place in real time where you're continually backing up information as that information is overwritten and changed and so forth. And there are really two key ways to do this, or two typical strategies. One is air-gapped, and that is just having a backup system that is disconnected from the network after the backup is performed. So normally people just have some hard drives that they rotate through the backup process, and those hard drives should be encrypted and they should be air-gapped from the network. So you perform the backup and then you disconnect those drives. Again, that way, if the malware or ransomware starts propagating across your network, it will not touch your backups, so that when restoration time comes around, you will actually have defiled data that you can use. And of course, similarly for hosted or cloud backup, you want to keep that off your network, and it is by definition, if it's off there on the cloud, off your network. But if it's on the cloud or hosted by a third party, then you need to think very carefully about how you secure access to that backup information, or you just may find that the attackers will target your online backups rather than your company directly. You should have multi-factor authentication. Nobody should be able to access cloud backup information without having a one-time code come to your phone or a little key fob that needs to be filled out and so forth. And it's not technically difficult for your cloud or hosting vendor to limit authentication attempts to your backups by your IP addresses. So in other words, if you've got a hosted backup, only IP addresses that belong to your company should be able to access that. Or maybe addresses, MAC addresses of specific computers. A MAC address is for a specific individual device. Or some kind of digital certificate or other digital signature type tool that can be used to effect a handshake with the service before you can log in. So all those things can limit the ability to attack those hosted or cloud-based backups. Now, to wrap up, I want to talk about ransomware. Ransomware is one of the most common breach types that occur these days. Ransomware doesn't care whether you're big or small, whether you're for-profit or non-profit or anything else. Ransomware is incredibly indiscriminate in who it targets. So there are some key things that everybody can do to defend against ransomware. First of all, put some controls in place of inbound emails. And next quarter, I think our webinar is actually going to be about email usage and safe email usage on the internet. So we'll talk about that next quarter, but just a couple things you want to keep in mind for today's purposes. Limit the attachments that come in, limit the links that come in the form of links and attachments attached to or embedded within emails. There may be some customer service issues there with those controls, but that is the most common way to get malware on networks these days. Prohibit macros. Macros are just little scripting tools, little programs that can run within, say, Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel. You should prohibit macros. Limit those macros only to people on your network who have an absolute business need to use them. Fanatically patch your Adobe software. Adobe software is just a train wreck from a security perspective, and keeping it patched and up to date is essential. Harden browsers. We've talked about that a little bit in our last webinar. We'll talk about it more in future webinars, but certainly restricting scripts that can run in the background on your browsers is essential. And as Scott already alluded to, train users, what to look for so that they can avoid breaches, and as Scott mentioned, what to do if they let their guard down and something happens, right? The only thing worse than an employee falling for an attack is an employee falling for an attack, realizing that they fell for the attack, and then being afraid to say something about it because they don't want to be sanctioned by their boss or by HR. So you need to build a culture, again, as Scott talked about for culture, that encourages open dialogue about things that employees may have done by mistake. And then lastly, to wrap up, and we'll finish right on time here, to respond to ransomware, if and when you have that unfortunate ransomware event, ransomware has come in, it has encrypted the contents of your network, you have to ask the question, how long can we afford to be down with this? And how quickly can we restore our systems if we just want to wipe everything down to bare metal and start over again? So in the typical response to a threat, humans either fight or they flight, right? That's the psychologist term for these things. And to fight ransomware is to try to eradicate it. So there's our third Easter egg for those of you sitting in for CPE purposes. You need to have that removal software. There's lots of vendors out there that have eradication removal software for different types of ransomware. And you need to have those offline backups that are either air-gapped and or cloud hosted. A combination of removal software and a solid undefiled backup will allow you to have a chance to fight the malware, to fight it. The alternative, of course, is just to pay up and just give it up and pay and get back to work. Now, in order to do that and to do it quickly and efficiently, you're going to want to have a cryptocurrency wallet already set up. So there are plenty of wallet applications out there. If you want to ask about them, we can talk about the pluses and minuses. Don't hesitate to reach out. We can talk about the pluses and minuses of some of the different apps out there. But you should have a wallet. You should have some Bitcoin in it so that you are ready and able to make that cryptocurrency payment that the ransomware extortionists will demand. And do keep in mind that while most extortionists who use ransomware will give you the decryption key because they want people to think that paying will result in cleaning of the ransomware, but there are no guarantees. And there are flyby attackers who really don't care and are just going to leave you encrypted whether you pay the Bitcoin or not. And you need to have that in mind. So even if you do agree to pay, you still need to think about what you're going to do if they don't follow up. So that's it. We'll finish just a minute late here. Again, thanks everybody for your time and attention. There's a lot we could summarize here, but we'll just wrap it up very briefly by saying you need to have a plan in place, and hopefully today's webinar will help you with some of the outline of the steps that you need to have that plan in place, and that it really is an administrative, human, and technical process, that just one or the other alone is not going to get the job done. You really need to look at it from all possible angles. So that's it. That's what we had for you this morning. Any final questions or comments? I see a question here from Howard. We will put a copy of the slides together, and Maggie or someone in our marketing team will do a follow-up email, and we'll get a copy of the slide deck out to you, Howard, and all attendees. Yeah, great question. Any other questions or comments? All right, well, if there's nothing else at this time, I know that's a lot of information that we dumped on you in a short period of time, so we will send out a copy of the slide deck along with our contact information. So if any other questions occur to you as you sort of further digest all of this information, please don't hesitate to reach out to Scott and or me. We're always happy to take your questions and comments. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, everybody online.